Hello everyone, this is Bobbin Threadbare and welcome back to Weaving Worlds. Today I'm going to discuss one of the most important character development questions and show you how you can also use it to develop your setting and your backstory. What's their motivation? Why did certain people make certain choices? What are their goals? How much did they think their plans through? When you ask these questions about the nations and historical figures of your setting, the answers you get can really help you understand where your imagined setting is and where it may be heading. Motivation and the human experience. There is a reason behind every action that every human makes. These reasons aren't always good or sensible or deep or rational, but they always exist. It can take a lifetime of study and research to understand how the human mind works, but in my opinion it's always worth the effort, and it always helps authors who want to write realistic characters and societies. I could go on and on about how to develop protagonists and antagonists with realistic motivations and goals, but there are other resources you can use, and this video series is specifically about setting construction. So, here's the deal. What's true about the characters in the present of your story is just as true about all of the important figures who came and went in your setting's history. They had ideals, desires, and needs. They succeeded at some things and failed at others, and when they failed, it was often because other people with competing desires stopped them. Societies as a whole can have motivations, since groups will act based on majority opinions, and so understanding motivation will also let you determine how cultures or nations will react when the unexpected happens. Selfishness and selflessness. If you're going to break down human motivation into two groups, then I'd say the best categories are selfish motivations and selfless motivations. Now, both behaviors are ultimately similar, since selfless behavior comes from being selfish for the sake of a larger sense of self, projected onto a family or a community. But the specific actions tend to be very different, as are the ways that people react to them. Selfish behavior means hurting other people or ignoring their pain so that you can concentrate on helping yourself or the people you like. A corrupt leader is selfish when they take tax money and give it to their friends and allies, or when they take private money to make public decisions that help the briber and no one else. A culture is selfish when it believes that only its members are good and worthy people, and everyone outside of that culture is inferior, ignorant, lazy, sinful, and all the other negative attributes assigned by racism and nationalism. Selfless behavior means using your own resources or putting yourself in harm's way in order to help other people, whether they're family members, community members, nations as a whole, or even complete strangers and foreigners. A selfless leader will distribute tax money to programs and people that need it instead of the people who ask for it, and they will refuse to accept any bribes for personal enrichment no matter what they're offered or who asks for it. A culture can be selfless by promoting outreach and diversity, encouraging charity work, and telling its members that all people are ultimately equal. And just one little side note I'd like to make here is that selfish behavior is much easier when it is inflicted on people you don't know and never met, whereas selfless behavior is much easier to do when you know who you are benefiting. Motivating historical figures. When it comes to motivation and setting construction, historical figures are the easiest to handle. You can treat a historical figure as a minor character, so you can get away with just a basic description and a straightforward personality. You'll need to write out a story for them, but it only has to be a couple of sentences long, and after that you can start to think about the consequences of their actions and how that affects the world around them. Let's go back to that floating island world for an example. Paula Verhoeven developed the first true flying machine in 1033, around 50 years ago. Before her, everyone had to rely on either gliders or magic power. So, why did she build this device? It's because in her society, women are traditionally in charge of maintaining machinery, while studying magic is restricted to men. Thanks to Paula's invention, travel between islands has become much easier and more frequent, and the vast majority of modern aeronauts and couriers are women. Because I needed a reason for Paula to invent flying machines, I've established a technology level, I've created an important set of rules about the society she lives in, and I've shown how her actions have had an important impact on the present day of the setting. I started with a statement of fact, I asked the question why, and in the process of answering that question, I developed my setting. That's why exploring motivations helps. Motivating societies. Societal motivations are similar to personal motivations, but there are a few extra layers. A person can have conflicting ideals and motivations, but ultimately they can only do one thing at a time. Societies with conflicting ideals can move in several directions at the same time, and the conflicts between each segment can involve repression, violence, public speeches, terrorism, underground movements, and everything else you can think of. As such, when you create a motivation for a society, it helps to also create the opposite motivation and figure out who believes in that, where they live, what they do to support their ideas, and why they oppose the majority opinion. Let's go back to that society Paula Verhoeven is a part of. Why can only men use magic? Well, like virtually every modern culture, there's a long history of misogyny, and so women have been excluded from learning magic since it's a source of power. Now, after generations of exclusion, the people of Paula's society believe that women are simply incapable of performing magic, and the few exceptions to that rule will never be as good at it as a man. However, not everyone believes this. Paula and women like her have proved over the last few decades that women can be just as rationally minded as men, and some magic schools have opened their doors to female students. There's also a rival nation, where women have been magic users for centuries, and they've only just come into contact with Paula's nation thanks to her flying machine invention. This example illustrates how you can use societal motivations as the conflict for your story, and how these conflicts can be between cultures, within cultures, or both at once. Because of what we just added to the Flying Islands setting, we could write a story about a woman who wants to challenge the patriarchy by showing how she can perform magic just as well as any man. Or maybe we could write a story about a man who goes on a long and harrowing journey to that other nation so that his daughter can grow up free and learn magic if she wants. Adding societal conflicts doesn't just add realism, they also help you set up the personal conflicts of your story. Motivating villains. I'm making a separate segment about villains here because it's important to understand that they aren't always terrible people, or at least not just terrible people, because they are also the products of their environment. You don't see warlords appearing in the United States because people can't just gather some friends together, throw some guns into a few trucks, and then start raiding nearby towns for food and money. Amoral lobbyists don't exist in the war-torn parts of Somalia because there's no money and no infrastructure there to take advantage of. Villains are very often in a position of power at the start of speculative fiction stories because having that power allows them to pose a serious threat to the protagonists. Depending on how much power they can have a serious impact on the society around them, or maybe the reason they have so much power is because they're a perfect example of the kind of values their society holds. Either way, you can create a very compelling villain by giving them a relatable motivation that just so happens to bring them into conflict with the protagonist. For instance, a good villain for the women's rights magician would be a college dean who firmly believes that no woman could ever equal a man in magic use. He's a nice person under normal circumstances, and he loves his wife and daughters, and in fact he encourages his daughters to excel in other professions, but he hates the idea of being wrong about this. And so he leads the charge against the protagonist, and he never truly changes his mind, even after she shows her worth and convinces the rest of the college to embrace integration. A villain for the travel story could be a ranger, a female ranger, who wants to catch the man and his daughter and bring them back home. She doesn't do this because they're breaking the law, but because it's dangerous out in the wild islands. And yet, if she catches them, then they won't be able to live in that other country. Good intentions? bad results. Something else to understand about motivations and backgrounds is that bad things can happen even if the person who causes them has only the best of intentions. For instance, asbestos is a kind of stone fiber that works well as insulation and as a fire repellent, and so when industrial mining caught on in the 19th century, people started using it for everything. However, by the end of the century, doctors discovered that asbestos fibers can cause lung disease, and by the 1930s it was clear that asbestos was killing product users, not just unprotected miners. Maybe a country assassinates an evil dictator, but the guy who replaces him is even worse. Maybe a charity group sends a relief effort to a country hit by a hurricane, but the country's leaders steal the food and sell it on to enrich themselves. Maybe a preacher spreads a message of love, hope, and equality, but 1,000 years later his followers and the followers of a rival preacher go on to slaughter each other in the hundreds of thousands. You don't often get to show how good intentions can lead to bad long-term results in stories, so putting them into your setting background is a great way to highlight that sort of thing. Bad intentions, good results. In the mid-14th century, the Black Plague spread throughout Europe and the Middle East, killing an estimated 1/3 to 1/2 of the human population. The death toll was beyond comprehension, but the sudden loss of manpower in Western Europe made the living peasants more valuable. As such, they and the lesser nobility were able to win themselves some extra rights and representation in the otherwise centralizing governments of Spain, France, and England. In the 1920s, rampant speculation and borrowing caused the Great Stock Market crash of 1929 and the Great Depression of the 1930s. However, this hardship allowed FDR to become president and allowed him and his successor Lyndon Johnson to create the welfare state and provide certain services and assistance to the most vulnerable citizens of the United States. Even the most terrible events to ever take place usually have something good come out of them. These good things don't always make up for the destruction and loss that the events cause, and they aren't always the intended result of the people who cause such events, but people have a knack for using lemons to make lemonade. You can use this historical trend to really deepen your setting's backstory and demonstrate how people and cultures can move on from even the darkest of tragedies. Maybe that floating island nation just went through a big war that devastated their cities and killed 1/4 of the civilians through starvation and disease. However, technology advanced by leaps and bounds as the nation tried to keep up with their rivals, and women have been allowed to work in dozens of new job fields, including magic, because of the worker shortfall. Motivation is an essential part of being human, and if you can understand the motivations of historical figures and cultures, then you can develop a very strong setting with just a few questions and answers. After all, no matter how out there your setting is with magic, future technology, or impossible creatures, a reasonable motivation will make everything seem much more realistic. Thanks for joining me again for today's journey into weaving worlds. Please like, share, and subscribe because that raises my visibility here on YouTube. Check out my other stuff if you have some time, support me on Patreon if you have some money, and I hope I'll see you again for the next video.